Good evening. Almost 10 years ago, a shocked nation stood still, trying to comprehend the significance of a major attack on its soil. Few do not recall exactly where they were when they first heard the news and saw the images of New York and the Pentagon. A few weeks later, while still struggling to comprehend the event, a Washington, D.C. post office branch and Capitol Hill became riddled with anthrax. As the details of the 9/11 plot unfolded around the globe, one thing became clear. There was not a well-developed standard operating procedure for handling major attacks originating within the United States of America. NORAD had been created decades earlier to protect against attacks on our shores by foreign nations, but this was different. This was asymmetrical warfare on our home turf by foreign non-state actors. In the year that followed, Northern Command was created. Its mission: to conduct homeland defense, to provide civil support, and to engage in security cooperation in order to defend and secure the United States and its interests. As a member of the United States Naval Reserve, I was proud to become one of the plank holders of Northern Command, a term given to servicemen and women who join a command in its first year. Much has been accomplished since Northern Command's inception, but new challenges also have arisen. Just consider the plight of Monterrey, Mexico, which many consider a sister city to Houston, not to mention what has befallen the many communities in our borderlands. Tonight it is my pleasure to introduce Lieutenant General Frank Grass, the Deputy Commander of U.S. Northern Command and the Vice Commander of the U.S. Element at the North American Aerospace Defense Command at Peterson Air Force Base in Colorado Springs, Colorado. In his current capacity, he helps lead the command to anticipate, prepare, and respond to threats and aggression aimed at the United States, its territories, and its interests within the assigned area of responsibility and as directed by the President or the Secretary of Defense. Previously, Lieutenant General Grass served as Director of Operations for USNORTHCOM, where he was the principal advisor to the commander on all operational matters, providing strategic guidance to plan and execute U.S. NORTHCOM missions, including air, land, maritime, ballistic missile defense, and cyber homeland defense operations, as well as support of civil authorities. Please join me in welcoming Lieutenant General Kratz.
Thank you, thank you. Well, first of all, thanks, Joan, for inviting me. And Edmund Winnefeld would be here. Let's see, 2 weeks ago he was testifying in front of the House. Last week it was the Senate. He's headed back that way this week, so he sends his regrets, but he definitely wanted to be here and wanted one of his staff to be here to spend time with this group. As I went through the list of attendees, I was very impressed because it's not always that you get such a broad brush between international representatives, local government, county government, state government, students, academia, as well as the military and the Coast Guard, which plays both roles. So as I went through it, I thought, wow, what a great opportunity to have a dialogue with folks that really are focused on public policy. And I'm going to go through and just give you a snapshot of what is NORAD and NORTHCOM and what do we do each day and what are some of our concerns. And I'd like you to, at the end, hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. I'd like you to maybe challenge me, tell me what you think. As budgets begin to draw down, you know, we weren't sure if we were going to get here today or not because our airplane would have probably been canceled. We would have still came to work, but may not have been able to get down to Houston. But as budgets begin to dwindle, what happens to Homeland? What happens to support to civil authorities from the federal government as the budgets draw down? What should that policy be for the future? Because we're dealing with that now. We're starting to look at that, of how we can do our jobs better in the future. Next slide. Oh, I got it. You taught me how to do this already. Okay, the Norad mission, I'll start with that. You can see it on the bottom there. It's aerospace warning, aerospace control, and maritime warning. The aerospace control and aerospace warning mission dates back to 1958 for NORAD. And it was a treaty between the U.S., an agreement between the U.S. and Canada for North America. And it really was focused at that time to the Cold War era and Russian bombers that were trying to, I wouldn't say penetrate our airspace, but work around our airspace to see if there were any gaps in our airspace. Believe it or not, the Russians still do that today. And what we do in the U.S., as long as we can identify the aircraft electronically, we will not intercept it. They come on the outer ends. This morning, there were a couple bear bombers that will fly over out of forward bases in Russia, and just their training. So we've invited them to come to Elmendorf Air Force Base and buy fuel from us. And we actually had a Russian general in our headquarters last week. So we're having a great dialogue. The Canadians, they will send up their Canadian Force 18s, F-18s, every time to intercept them. Every time. That's just their policy. So then that requires us to put tankers up to refuel them as they're flying over the northern part of North America. But we want to continue to build a partnership with the Russian military. Last summer, we did an exercise called Vigilant Eagle. We're hoping to do it again this year. And we took a private plane, a jet, and we flew it across the Pacific Ocean from the west coast of the United States, and we flew it over to Japan. And we were testing communications with the Russian Air Force. And what we did is we actually had a Russian general in our headquarters in Colorado Springs at Peterson Air Force Base, and then we had representatives in Moscow. And we simulated that private jet being hijacked and our fighters escorting that plane across the Pacific, and then the Russians met it with MiGs and then escorted it into Japan, and then we did the reverse. So we're hoping to continue to partner with the Russians. So again, what was the Cold War when we were concerned about each other, we're trying to partner more and more with the Russians. So that's really the aerospace warning, aerospace history. After 9/11, though, now we're focused not just externally, but internally more than anything. And I'll give you a couple of examples of things to think about, because it's very expensive for the taxpayers, is what should be our response when an aircraft takes off out of California, private plane, jet, and it's flying to New Jersey. And we know it, FAA knows it, they're sitting in our command center. Aircraft's on flight plan, but it goes over Chicago on flight plan, and it is not talking to anyone for an hour and 15 minutes. What happens today under the Norad Mission, Norad agreement, and this is a real world event that happened about 3 weeks ago, is we will go send F-18s, or well, in this case, the U.S. intercepted it with F-16s, and 2 F-16s go up, meet the guy. The guy realizes something's wrong when he's got 2 F-16s escorting him, and he flicks down at his radio and realizes he missed a frequency change over Chicago. Flipped his radio, came up, FAA immediately told him to land, and I'm sure his license is probably on the edge right now with a big bill. But what should be our policy? We have 40 fighters on alert every day, which is a huge bill, and 7 tankers out there every day to defend and control airspace over the United States. That's one event. We probably have 200 or 300 of those every year, that kind of a thing. Anything from somebody locking themselves in a restroom on a commercial jet, we take it serious. Disruptive passenger, we take very serious. Small planes flying in a restricted space over our capital, that happens every other week. But we either put helicopters from the Coast Guard up to identify the aircraft, or we'll put fighters on them to make sure that they land somewhere. But it's very expensive for the taxpayers. We're having that debate now. What should we do for the future based on what happened on 9/11? The Maritime Warning Mission is a new one that came for NORAD in 2006, and we're trying to figure out what does that mean with U.S. and Canada and the Coast Guard. Where does the Homeland Security, law enforcement type response, where does that end, and where does Homeland Defense and the military take over, both for the U.S. and Canada? And we're trying to have that debate now. The maritime, we feel, is probably one of the most vulnerable areas we have in this country, both U.S. and Canada. So we're really looking closely at that. We see a lot of cruise liners come in with people of interest, people that have a background, that law enforcement's been watching them. Of course, the Coast Guard does a great job in shipboarding and making sure those people don't get off the ships. But again, it's a mission that both the U.S. and Canada share under the NORAD agreement. Northern Command, as Joan said, we were established as a response to 9/11 for a headquarters to have responsibility over the United States, and Canada is an area of focus that we have, as well as Mexico. And in 2008, we added Bahamas. We picked up the Bahamas as an area of focus for us. The Unified Command Plan for 2011 was just signed last week by the President, and it changes our area a little bit, and I'll show you that in a minute, talk to you about it. But the primary mission for Northcom is, you can see it there, Homeland Defense, civil support being, how do we support FEMA? How do we support Department of Homeland Security? How do we support Health and Human Services when their capacity to respond to the needs of our citizens is exceeded? And the National Guard's capability within the state is exceeded, as well as, of course, local responders first. And then the third mission, security cooperation, is where we work closely with Mexico and the Bahamas, and I'll talk a little more about that later. Admiral Winterfeld wears two hats. He has the NORAD mission and the Northcom mission. I'm his Northcom deputy. On the NORAD side, he has a Canadian 3-star, Lieutenant General Marcel Duval, who has worked a number of years. He's a Canadian pilot, and he has worked a number of years in the NORAD mission. Outstanding partnership. The two of us, though, and the operations directors are the only separate organizations today in NORAD Northcom. Everything else, if you go and talk to the personnel representative, or you talk to the logistic representative for the headquarters, or you talk to the intelligence or the law enforcement, any of those organizations, the planners, they're all combined. So you can go in and you can talk to the person working on federal plans for the future, and you can talk NORAD or Northcom to the same person. So we've combined them for efficiencies within the organization. One thing that is important here, Admiral Winterfeld talks frequently to the Chief of Defense Staff. The Chief of Defense Staff is led up by a 4-star Canadian, and additionally he talks to the Minister of National Defense. Once in a while he will meet with the Prime Minister, but that's his chain of command on the NORAD side. Of course, on the NORAD side, his responsibility under air control, air defense, falls in under the Secretary of Defense and the President. So he has two bosses under that hat. On his NORAD mission, his Northcom mission, you can see it there, it's the Secretary of Defense and the President. So it really made a lot of sense when they combined them in 2002. This is actually the 2008 area of responsibility. Think about it as an area of focus, because we're really not responsible. We're a supporting organization. But within the Department of Defense, this is our area of responsibility, which each combatant command has globally around. There's one for each of the regions of the world. You can see, actually, they're all on here, other than Central Command isn't shown on here. But I want to show you a couple of changes that have occurred. Up here in Alaska, you probably can't see the pointer, but it was crosshatched because we shared that area with Pacific Command out of Hawaii. Some of that was politically driven in the past. Other reasons were because the Pacific Command had such a large naval presence and aviation presence toward Korea, Japan. That was kind of the stopping off point, Elmendorf Air Force Base. As we debated that, though, we said, doesn't it make sense if we're talking homeland, shouldn't it all kind of be roll it under Northern Command? Because we're dealing with a state, we're dealing with a governor. And so in the Unified Command Plan that was signed last week, the crosshatch has been taken off, and now that is a Northcom responsibility. The forces there still may work with Pacific Command, and the aircraft may still flow through there and ships coming through there, but for homeland defense and civil support, if we're responding in support of the governor, is going to be Northcom. The other area, and it's not shown on here, is the Unified Command Plan of 11, can't see it here, but lays out the Arctic for the future. So the Arctic within the combatant commands now is divided to two combatant commands, European Command and Northern Command. So when you see the new lines up around, our area actually goes up around the North Pole now. And so we're working closely with Canada to build a strategy for the future of the Arctic, especially with the warming that's going on, and potential for future. I think the first thing we'll see is environmental tourism through the area. I think that's already starting. We'll look heavily to the Coast Guard and to Transport Canada and others to say, okay, what capability do we need up in the Arctic for search and rescue? And we've already partnered some with the Canadians on that and the Coast Guard to talk about what does it take to function and operate in the Arctic. The Canadians have great experiences up there. My counterpart, General Duval, talks about an exercise he did in the northern tier there of their country. And one military exercise actually drained all the resources, all the fuel for vehicles, all the fuel for inbound and outbound aircraft, most of the stores of food and supplies for the whole year in one summer exercise in this little town that they did the exercise in. So he says, when you work into the Arctic region, you've got to understand that you're placing a huge load on people that spend the whole summer moving supplies around so they can live. So first of all, you got to create your logistics chain to get there. Once you get there, GPS and radios may not work, or maybe off calibration. So those are kind of some of the things we're talking about now. Ice cutters. The U.S. I think the Coast Guard's got one active right now. Is that right? And maybe another one coming up. So how are we going to deal with that in the future? We did an exercise last summer with the Canadians, and it was in response to a scientific station called North Pole 37. And it was a Russian research station up on the North Pole area, not on the North Pole. And the ice around it started breaking up in the summer. And they were floating on ice, and the closest Russian vessel, ice cutter, was 1,400 kilometers away. The Russians didn't ask us for any help, but we teamed up with Canada Command, which is a sister command and very similar to the way Northcom is designed. And we worked with them and looked at their otters and air resupply and other things to look at ways that if the Russians said, hey, we can't get there, can you rescue the people on this scientific station and their gear? And we never had to do it. The cutter did get there in time before they completely broke up. But we worked through that, and we learned a lot of things about where our gaps are. So we'll continue to work for that for the future. And by having that area now assigned to us as a part of the Unified Command Plan will help us coordinate closely, especially with the Russians and European Command. Our headquarters has a mix of interagency and international partners. And on the left side there, international, we have 125 Canadian officers and NCOs that work in our command. Everyone is, full player, just like an American. You can be sitting in a meeting, and it may be a Northcom issue that a Canadian's briefing on, and you go to another meeting, and it could be a U.S. officer briefing on a NORAD over a Canadian issue up in Canada. So we're very well integrated, and that goes back to the 58 years or 53 years of existence, 1958. In addition, I know you just saw the clip on Mexico. We now have a Sedena and Samar LNO in our headquarters, and they are outstanding officers. Sedena, of course, is the Air Force and Army of Mexico, and Samar is the Marines and Navy of Mexico. We have a very good working relationship with them. They help us to understand some of the issues they're going through. Admiral Winnefeld has a great working relationship with General Galvan and Admiral Sainz, who are their two commanders, and he meets with them frequently. And he's actually got another trip coming up pretty soon here to go to Mexico. And so partnership with Mexico is growing rapidly for us. In the middle, you'll see Department of Defense partners. Just about every organization within the Department of Defense is represented there at Northcom. And at the top of that is the Army and Air National Guard. And we have an Air National Guard 2-star who really works all of the missions under the Northcom side for the boss with the National Guard. So he's our liaison with General McKinley, the 4-star chief of the Guard Bureau. And then they liaison with the adjutants general and governors. If you look down through there, probably another partner that we work closely with, as well as FEMA and DHS, is the Corps of Engineers. And the Corps of Engineers can respond directly to needs of FEMA and Department of Homeland Security. So we have liaisons with the Corps of Engineers right in our headquarters, and they bring a lot of capability in the Homeland, not just military capability, but a whole lot of contract capability of firms and corporations across the United States to respond to disasters. And on the right side, interagency partners. We have 60 interagency partners from within the federal government. And we have some NGOs and some faith-based organization liaisons. Of those 60 partners, partner organizations, there are 90 people represented, and most of them work right there in Colorado Springs. So if I want to talk to Health and Human Services, I go down the hall and I grab George Havens and say, George, let's talk about pandemic. If I want to talk to Department of Homeland Security, I go down the hall and I talk to Bill Brundage. He's a general officer equivalent in Department of Homeland Security who works right on Janet Napolitano's staff. And he gets us into conversations with her at times, with her staff on a conference call. If I want to, this morning I wanted to know something about FEMA and what FEMA was doing in the Red River of the North up in Minnesota, North Dakota, South Dakota. Mike Tamelo and his partner came down and briefed me up on it. They're right in our headquarters. So you can go through all the agencies of the U.S. government and get a pretty good flavor there. And I came from European Command before coming out to Northcom. And we had a great organization in interagency, but not as robust. But it didn't need to be as robust because of what we do is support these organizations in time of need. These really, if you break down our missions into 3 mission sets, these are what we call our 3 primary mission sets for NORAD and NORTHCOM. And NORAD primarily falls in under the Homeland Defense side of that. And I'm going to go through each one of these separately and show you what we've got going on today. Again, Homeland Defense, security cooperation really is where we interact with those other countries within our area, and then civil support where we're supporting another agency of the federal government or supporting them through a request from a governor. In fact, what we did yesterday, we launched 4 planners, a logistics planner, a medical planner, a lieutenant colonel lead to go with the team, and then a search and rescue planner up to work with FEMA and North Dakota State on the Red River flooding that's going on up there. Starting with Homeland Defense, air sovereignty, I talked a little bit about it. It really is 2 things. It's looking outward as well as looking inward and being able to respond to a potential for an attack like we had on 9/11. And maritime domain awareness, I already talked that preventing a maritime 9/11 is really what we're looking at. And we're concerned about what we call something like a scud in the tub. In other words, a rogue vessel that comes in toward one of our ports. I know a Coast Guard captain here definitely would appreciate this, but how do we prevent that from happening someday? Someone having a missile on board of a ship that stands off 500 miles from our coastline, maybe even in another combatant command area, and launches it from a ship toward us. That capability is growing out there. So how do we plan for that in the future? Both NORAD, under the Norad Mission and NORTHCOM, and both for Canada and the U.S. So Canada is very interested in that potential threat, and we're looking closely at that. Under the land part of Homeland Defense, I'll talk a little more about violent extremism and what we see the trends are today and how things are changing in that world. Our primary mission when it comes to violent extremism is looking at the threat against the Department of Defense. In other words, the threat against our facilities, and it happens very frequently. We just had a threat over the weekend against an installation. Most of them turn out to be nothing, but we take them all serious because Admiral Winnefeld has to set the baseline force protection conditions for all U.S. forces in the homeland. So whether you're going to go on Camp Pendleton with the Marine, or you're going to go to Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri on the Army base, or you're going to go to an air base, Andrews Air Force Base, Admiral Winnefeld responsible to maintain contacts both with the intelligence community in the United States as well as overseas, and then with the law enforcement from the federal all the way down to the local level. And we do that through a network of communications that we use. And it's not impossible, but it's very difficult sometimes dealing in the homeland and handling information about U.S. citizens that have gone radical. because we all want to protect the civil liberties of every one of our citizens, but at the same time, the authorities rest with the law enforcement, so they've got to be willing to share the information with the Department of Defense representatives so we can determine whether there's really a threat to an installation and change that force protection level so the security forces at the gates of each of these installations are aware of what's happening out there. Missile defense, of course, we have the ground-based interceptors in Fort Greely, Alaska, as well as Vandenberg Air Force Base. There's a few at Vandenberg Air Force Base, California. And Admiral Winnefeld is responsible to have those ready to go 24/7 for a potential limited intercontinental ballistic attack on the U.S. That was why the systems were built. Right now, Congress is debating where do we want to go for the future. Should we have a different construct than what we have today? Again, it's really designed against a rogue threat as well as a North Korean threat or an Iranian threat with an ICBM to be shot at the U.S. someday. Every time that North Korea stacks a space launch, we go on alert, and we're prepared so that if that missile goes erratic and it's going to hit somewhere in the U.S., that we're prepared to shoot it down. The system is still being developed. So the sensors, which are constantly being upgraded, new hardware, new software, the sensors are pretty much managed by U.S. Strategic Command. The research and development and the fielding of the missiles and the new technology going into them, and it is a constantly changing technology, that's all done by Missile Defense Agency. A 3-star Army general is in charge of that. And then Admiral Winnefeld's got to balance all that and be ready to shoot them 24/7 if we have an inbound missile. So a real balancing act on that, but it's a very capable system, and we continue to develop that technology. And primarily, it's not focused at a large launch on the U.S. It's really focused at rogue nations that would get intercontinental ballistic missiles in the future, or some of them that already have them, that would turn to use them against us. Cyber is a new area, and our cyber domain is really working closely with General Alexander's office. General Alexander, who is the NSA chief, now also owns Cyber Command for the U.S. military. He works in support of Department of Homeland Security in the cyber world. Our role at Northern Command is first to defend our own networks when they come under attack, and they come under attack every day, as probably yours do right here at Rice University. But also, our mission is to support the interagency partners when they come under attack and the consequences of an attack. So let's say a cyber attack shuts down part of the power grid, and we get a request from the Department of Energy maybe to try to find additional generators, or a power system that supports a water treatment plant somewhere. We could provide that support. If the state said they couldn't do it, we would work with the Corps of Engineers or someone else to provide. So again, our role is responding to the consequences of a cyber attack. But General Alexander, as Cyber Command, and he works for Strategic Command out of Omaha, he's actually based out of the East Coast, but his role is to work with DHS to go after the perpetrators of the attack, which could be anywhere in the world. I wanted to key in on this for a minute because this is the disturbing trend in the homeland that we see on the violent extremist organizations. And since 2009, we've seen kind of a morphing of the threat. And again, we look at it for two things. One, so we can advise Admiral Winnefeld about where to set the force protection conditions for each of the installations and regions of the U.S. military across the map of the U.S. But also, are there things that law enforcement might ask the National Guard to support, and we'll be monitoring that, or are there things that could happen in an attack where we might be asked to provide consequence management support to a U.S. agency, as in 9/11. So we track these very closely. But if you look at the trend from 2001, which was primarily core al-Qaeda prime, I mean, no doubt about it. But as you go further and further away from 2001, you start to see all these alliances, and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. But now in 2009, we start to see homegrown terrorism at rampant pace. And what really disturbs us is many of the plots here that you see, and you can look at the bottom summary there, 22 plots in 2009 to 11, including, I think, Andy, was it 4 this year already? I think we're tracking. That 69% of them were directed at military, 62% were disrupted. But you can look at the type of plots and which ones, you know, resulted in deaths, either military or civilian. So as we watch this trend, these folks that are becoming violent extremists are American citizens. Very difficult to deal with in the homeland because it's a law enforcement role. But the military wants to know, but that American citizen may have deployed overseas. And we want to protect the civil liberties, and we want to protect the information on that person, but how do you share that back in the homeland with a Title X, federal organization? So we constantly debate this and go through this. These, most of the groups we're seeing are individuals, not groups. What we see is that they're second and third generation immigrants to the U.S. They're not being well assimilated into our population. There's something happening there. Most of them are well educated. Many of them have bachelor's degrees. And then there's something that triggers them to go violent, even within our own military. So it's very concerning to us. We're looking at it very closely. Last week I had an opportunity, our chaplain hosted a group of chaplains from the military, from the National Guard, as well as faith-based organizations from around the United States. And we just had a little bit of a dialogue, says, what's causing this? What does our society need to do to change this? It's not a role for the military, but we're concerned because there's a threat against us. And so I haven't heard the feedback of that one, but I kind of threw that on the table and then left them to study it for about 3 days. So when I get back this week, I should hear back from that group. But there's something out there that's really causing these folks to become violent extremists, and they are American citizens. Okay, defense support to civil authorities. I'm going to show you a little bit on the national response framework that we work with closely with FEMA in a few minutes here, but I'll just walk you through. Primarily for us, it's responding to a disaster, whether it's a fire, flood, tornado. Most of that, and I would say 90% of that, is done every day by your National Guard across the map. And we have about 45 National Guardsmen. I'm a Missouri National Guardsman, and by law, either the commander or the deputy for Northern Command has to be a guardsman for a very good reason, because it teams up. General McKinley and Admiral Winnefeld talk all the time. We're very closely connected to the adjutants general, and the governors. They actually have formed a council that advises the Secretary of Defense on relationships, on how do we respond when a disaster occurs. The first responders are going to be there. Many in this room, whether it's it's local, county, the state will come in. If the state is exceeded, they can ask for our help, and that's why it's very important that we stay close and see what the National Guard is doing out there. But they're going to do probably 90% every day of the disaster relief out there across the map. I think this morning, North Dakota, Minnesota, South Dakota had 800 guardsmen up on the Red River, checking the levees, having traffic control points, delivering supplies. That kind of thing goes on every day around our map somewhere. The national special security events, like the G8, G20 summit, we work closely with the National Guard on those events. And to give you an example, the G20 summit in Pennsylvania about 1.5 years ago, the National Guard stood up a task force led by a 2-star. They had a commander who supported that 2-star with National Guard forces in we call Title 32 status. They're exempt from posse comitatus, so they can actually support law enforcement. But on the active duty Title 10 side, they wanted some support. They wanted some Chembio capability. So we put a active duty Title 10 officer in there to work for them, and then he could command and control the Title 10 forces. So you've got law enforcement. The Guard has a lot of capability that they can do and support. On the Title 10 active side, we can't do that, but we can bring in other assets. In this case, we were prepared with chemical, biological, radiological detection teams if something would have went bad. Luckily, most of the national special security events have been pretty successful with the law enforcement locally taking care of all the issues. But we prepare for all of those. We just did the State of the Union there in January. The inauguration, when President Obama was sworn in, 2.5 million Americans on the mall. We had aircraft positioned as far out as Maryland and West Virginia. They were medevac capability, and the intent was, at the time, when we looked at the population of DC, most of the hospitals in the whole region were running about 90% capacity. We said, even if it wasn't terrorist, we could have an event occur on the mall that people could get stampeded just by whatever, you name it. There were so many people packed in there. So we have to expand the capability in the medical world. So what we did is we worked with the Military District of Washington, with the National Capital Region, to be prepared to fly in with helicopters, ground ambulances, and connect those to C-130s that could carry patients further to hospitals in the surrounding area. Just one mission that we do under a national special security event. At the same time, the National Guard had on hook about 2,000 soldiers and airmen in Virginia, Maryland, of course the District of Columbia, that were supporting law enforcement. I'll talk a minute about the process. I think the bottom little bumper sticker there is probably the most important, though. Day to day, the National Guard, Department of Homeland Security, FEMA, and the states are our key partners. And understanding the needs of those organizations and their capability and where they might have gaps is something we spend a lot of time on. I'm going to just run through. Some of you may have seen this. The National Response Framework is what pretty much FEMA and DHS, I mean, this is their Bible, if you want to call it that, for the National Guard as well as Northcom. This also will give you an idea of how we function day to day. Okay, so you have an event occur, or there's a forecasted event, let's say. So we may get a pre-declaration, which is something that came out of Katrina. FEMA really didn't have the resources to act in response to something that they knew was going to happen, so like a hurricane. They had to wait till it occurred, and then they could get a declaration, and then they could go forward and go to work. After Katrina, the pre-declaration, which is it's a major disaster declaration by the president that says, okay, this hurricane has the potential to do great damage in life and property. So let's prepare for this. Just like we're doing right now in the Red River of the North, we're working with FEMA to prepare for a potential disaster in Fargo and Grand Forks, North Dakota, if a levee breaks. So far, we've been in pretty good shape there. So we can do a pre-declaration. FEMA may request, just like they did in North Dakota and Minnesota, they asked for a base support installation from the military. So we gave them a facility. This just happens to be just outside of Minneapolis right now. They're using it, and they're staging supplies there. Even though no levees have broke, nothing has happened there, but they're staging supplies so that if something occurs, you'll have food, water, blankets, tents, housing. It's all there. That would have not happened in Katrina because they didn't have the resources of the authority. Now we have that to pre-stage. So the local first responders come to a disaster, and we're going to use this hurricane scenario. And the first thing that will happen, and you'll see right over here where it says DCO, DCE, that's our defense coordinating officers, colonels from the Army that are assigned to work very closely with each FEMA region. There's one per FEMA region. And they will be called in, and they have a team called the Defense Coordinating Element that can come in and support and tie into the FEMA region so they understand what FEMA might need, what the state might need, what the National Guard's putting forward. That's once the capabilities of the first responders is exceeded. State request, State Operations Center stands up. Actually, that occurred the last few days up in Minnesota, North Dakota area. The states have stood up their State Operations Center. I think, is there somebody in here that's also tied in with the state emergency management? I guess not. First responders, state stood up. National Guard assets are being called in by the governor in this case. They're trying to establish the type of damage that may have occurred. What kind of response capability do they need? What do you have in the state? If it exceeds state, local, as well as National Guard response, the National Guard can go to other states and ask for support. So let's just say, as happened in Katrina, Louisiana needed some support. The state of Texas sent Task Force Lone Star, 1,300 troops, hauling supplies into Louisiana. who then fell in under the governor's control of Louisiana in Katrina. If you remember seeing the trucks coming in, the first trucks that arrived into New Orleans, those were Texas Guard, the Task Force Lone Star. So thank you, Texas, for getting there. But those were the first folks there. Okay, so capacity from the state, capacity from the National Guard is exceeded, or there may be some unique capacity needed, and this is all under the Stadford Act. The governor can request from the president, whether you have a major disaster declaration, or if it's immediate emergency, the president could declare an emergency declaration, which also brings funds to the state. The president then would turn that over probably to the Department of Homeland Security, but let's say it's a nuclear incident. He might turn it to the National Regulatory Commission. He might turn it to Department of Energy. And then under the Economy Act, they can ask for assistance from other agencies of the federal government. Most of what we do comes through the Department of Homeland Security. At the same time all of this is going on, the Joint Field Office of FEMA in the region would be standing up. Our Defense Coordinating Officer is plugged in there, as well as working with the State Operations Center. So we're getting a picture at that point, and our Defense Coordinating Officer is calling back to our headquarters to say, it could be something like, we need additional helicopters, or we're going to need additional heavy haul trucks. So they're starting to craft for us what capabilities are needed to fill the gap. So the primary agency in this case happens to be DHS in this scenario. They send a request for assistance to the Secretary of Defense. Then he passes it to Northern Command because it's in our area of responsibility. And then we begin to try to find that capability from the U.S. military. And it could be any of the services. And we do submit a request for assistance and a request for forces and then match them up and then get them moving as quick as possible. That actually is all being documented and tracked fiscally because the agency requesting is going to pay back the Department of Defense for whatever they use. Whether it's a helicopter, a plane, a truck, they're going to pay back. And that's just the way the Stadford Act is written. I'm going to shift gears for a second, and I thought this was important to throw in here. Chembio, Radiological, and Nuclear Response Enterprise is something that we're building over the last few years. The capability exists today in the United States, and it's really designed to be able to respond to either a Chembio nuclear accident or an attack by a terrorist in the homeland. And this capability, I'm going to talk a little bit about each one of these, goes across about 18,000 troops from all the services. And we've recently kind of modified it. If you look at the green on the left side, that is all National Guard. And we've tried to push more regionally and into the states so that we can have life-saving and medical response and decontamination response as quick as possible to your homelands. And then on the right side, that is more designed for a catastrophic or 2 or 3 catastrophic. Let's say 2 or 3 nuclear devices were set off in the United States. How would we respond? And that's the right side. By August of this year, we'll be about 50% complete with the stand-up of this capability. And then by August of 12, this whole capability will exist in the United States. And it will be, every year there'll be new units assigned, or we'll have that capability retained. And it really starts out with the WMD civil support teams, weapons of mass destruction civil support teams. There's 57 of them. Most states have one. New York, I think, has an extra. Let's see, New York, California, and I think Florida was going to get the other one. So some states have more than one. But those are full-time, every day, 22-person teams, and they can go in and survey an area and determine whether it's a chemical, biological, radiological threat. Probably once a week we see those teams across the map go under the governor's control and respond to an envelope that shows up at the post office with white powder coming out, or a chemical explosion that occurs at a plant, or a train derails and multiple cars with different chemicals hit each other. These folks go out and support the first responders. The second part of this enterprise is the Enhanced Response Force Package, which is about a company size, 186 people. There's going to be 17 of those. There are 17 today. They're actually being moved around a bit. But their capability is really, as you can see there, it's search and extraction from a rubble pile, and it could be a chem bio area where they're dealing in, or nuclear, and then decontamination and medical triage to support the first responders. Very small. You can look across the bottom, you can see the response timeframes of each of these. And then Homeland Response Force is the new design, which we're just starting to stand up. 2 of those this year. There's 1 per FEMA region across the U.S. Again, National Guard, there'll be 566. 25% of that unit will be full-time every day. And then the rest can be brought on just as a traditional guardsman. They'll be trained up and ready to go locally. Now you get into adding command and control in that environment, as well as some security, as well as the medical, the decon, and search and extraction. So that is really the first response of the military on that side. The blue, the top one, is the Defense Submarine Response Force, 5,200 people in that. It'll be certified. The first one will be certified this summer and be ready to go. It's really a capability that can come in and move in quickly once these other capabilities are used up, or it could be a nuclear environment where they can only stay so long and you need another force coming in, or it could be a large attack on the U.S. And then you can see the capabilities they bring, much more robust. And that's made up of all services inside there. And primarily, I think 90% right now of that is active duty, ready to go in 24 to 48 hours that could come in, could relieve the other forces if need be, or respond to another attack. I will tell you right now, we just shipped off 3 of the units out of that blue. They haven't even been certified yet, but we're working through that. They were certified in a previous mission that they were on. And we sent a joint assessment team to Japan early on at the request of Pacific Command, 9-person team that's really designed and understands working in a radiological environment. The next team we sent a few days later was a 35-person Air Force radiological assessment team, and primarily medical staff that understand working in a nuclear and radiological environment that can tell folks, hey, you're hot. You can't go back in there. You've been exposed to too much radiation, or you're getting close to your max. So we sent that team to Japan. And then last week, a week ago, we sent a team called an Immediate Response Force that the Marines have. It's about 150 people with an awful lot of equipment. And they went to Japan to support the Japanese Defense Force, primarily behind the scenes in training and trying to get, they're going to be dealing with this for a long time, so we're really training the Japanese Defense Force on how to deal with some of this. Immediately when we did that, we went to Joint Forces Command and said, okay, we've got this capability. Now what's the backup if something were to happen here? So we've already worked through and to try to bring additional forces on board so that we could immediately respond to something that would occur here. And the last block is really kind of an insurance policy. When they stand up, one will be stood up this year, the other one next year. It's called it's a command and control element of working in a chem bio radiological environment. And it's about 1,500 personnel. So they can actually go in to a site, and then they can receive other forces that maybe aren't quite as trained in the area and put them to work to certify them. And the intent is that if we had 2 or 3 simultaneous attacks in the U.S., we could respond to all. But I wanted to show you this because it's something that the Congress is very interested in. We have a report out due to them on the progress of this. It's a capability we definitely need to have here in the homeland, and now we're even learning that maybe something we can use in foreign consequence management in the future. The Homeland Response Forces and what we call the company size units that we were talking about, you can see the distribution here. The SURF, we call them the SURF-Ps. That company, you can see the states they're in. The new ones, there's actually 17 total. You can see them on the map there in the red. And then the blue are the states that are going to have the battalion, the 566-person teams. And then they will work within those FEMA regions. We're working FEMA plans right now on those. Shift gears quickly under security cooperation. We're not like an overseas command that has numerous countries to work with. We pretty much have those 3. Canada, Mexico, and the Bahamas. And we spend a lot of time with Mexico. In 2010, we had over 200 events working with Mexico. And an event could be a Mexican pilot, Mexican military pilot coming to the U.S. to train. It could be us sending a 3 or 4 person team down to a training base in Mexico for Samar or Sedena. And whatever they request, we try to provide. Our partnership is incredible with them. Under the Merida agreement, we're shipping helicopters to them. I think we sold 5. We sold them 5 UH-60s. We've got some fixed-wing capability, night vision goggles that they're buying, and so we help train them off back away from the area they're fighting in right now, as you saw, especially the northeast part, but back at their training facilities where their folks can train up. Of course, security cooperation is all about strengthening relationships, and the one thing we focus a lot on is communications, interoperability of aircraft and equipment because of the North American region and because of the transnational criminal organizations both Mexico and the Bahamas are dealing with. And you may know that as drug trafficking organizations. We call them transnational criminal organizations. And so we're working closely to make sure we have interoperability. We can share information, we can share intelligence back and forth. And then the next security cooperation mission that we're working on is the Arctic, and I mentioned that a little bit earlier, that we're working very closely. It's a sensitive issue with Canada because of sovereignty. It's a sensitive issue when dealing with Russia because of some of the areas they've expanded in. And so no one wants to militarize it, but we know we have to be prepared to respond in the area, and we have to have the capability to do that. So we think a partnership is the best way to go. So right now it's really focused on US and Canada partnering. I wanted to just, I know you saw the film earlier, and I wanted to give you a couple of things there. We wrote down some centers of gravity for the problem that Mexico is dealing with, and actually Mexico, US, as well as many countries in Central and South America on this drug trafficking. And probably the one that we should have on there is finance. Finance is a center of gravity because without the cash, these organizations don't exist. But the corrosive effects of these organizations in the homeland, Admiral Winnefeld likes to stress, 99% of what comes from the southern border comes to the US. 30,000 deaths a year, and it's only increasing. The Northeast, as you all are very familiar with here, Juarez all the way down to Laredo and through that area, Monterrey, Reynosa is the area that Mexico is really focusing in on, and General Galvan and Admiral Sainez have talked to us about that quite a bit of what they're doing. Entrenched in 270 US cities, whether it's in gangs, it's in drug dealers, whatever, but they're entrenched in 270 US cities. 36,000 Americans die every year of drug. Now, we're trying to break that out because some people die because they overdose on prescription drugs, but we think that most of that number, then the statistics we're looking at, is related to illegal drugs that are coming in. And of course, then lost productivity is a key one. $215 billion a year in the United States in lost productivity because of drug use. And then guns and money flowing south. And of course, we always have human rights concerns of what countries we can deal with and what we can provide. Congress looks very closely at us. Any training we do, all the people we're training have to be vetted before they can attend the training to make sure there's no connection to corruption. I would tell you that the relationship with Mexico is growing, but beyond Mexico, our relationship with the interagency is growing, with the Department of Homeland Security, with DEA, with Customs and Border Protection on the southwest border of the United States. Many of those states are participating, as Texas, very closely with us. We have Joint Task Force North based out of El Paso. They do work with the agencies all along the southwest border. But now we're expanding that, working with Customs and Border Protection. Alan Burson has really been a key catalyst in getting this started. But we're dealing in a new term which we call kind of cradle to grave, if you'd put it that way. We look at production in South America, and we work this closely with U.S. Southern Command out of Miami, and Joint Interagency Task Force South, which is based out of Miami as well, but they work the whole, from Mexico south through Central America, the flow of drugs. They interdict vessels. The Coast Guard, it's led by a Coast Guardsman right now. In fact, it always has, I think. About 27 to 29 countries represented in that JIATF, they call it. And so we're working with them. We're working with the countries from really Colombia north all the way up into the United States. And we're looking at this from production, where the drugs are produced, to transit routes, and from transit then to delivery in the States, where we have to back away because that's a law enforcement responsibility, but we want to know what's happening. And then the flow of cash and guns back south. And Alan Burson, he's the head of CBP, Customs Border Protection, has been a great partner. In fact, next week I'll be at a meeting with Coast Guard, a number of agencies within the U.S. government. We continue to hammer away at this. What can we do? You can't treat it as a Mexico problem alone. If you look at the precursor chemicals, most of them are coming on ships out of Asia. If you look at some of the drugs are now flowing across into African nations, so the commander of AFRICOM is very concerned. So we're trying to bring everyone together and look at it holistically and say, okay, how can we help? And of course, again, when you cross the border for us, that we really rely heavily in the homeland, but on the law enforcement. But the drug demand reduction is something that this nation is going to have to deal with here sometime. This is something we talk to a lot of our commanders about. And I think it really applies not just to our commanders, it applies to law enforcement, probably applies to many of you in this room, but how have things changed after 9/11? Of course, everything happens faster. That second bullet about understanding the fourth generation enemy who uses your systems, who communicates on our satellites, who uses our freedoms against us. How do you deal with that if you're a commander, whether it's on the border of the United States somewhere, or at a base in the U.S., or in Iraq, Afghanistan, Kosovo, you name it? How do you deal with that? So we're working closely with our military to try to educate future leaders about this fourth generation enemy. And you can look kind of in the middle there where it says commanders are increasingly trying to use all instruments of power. What in World War II a general officer would have had to know, today a lieutenant and a captain have to be aware of. The actions, the way they approach themselves in an environment can have an impact on diplomacy, on information flow, on the military in that country. The economic elements are also applied through the State Department, working closely with USAID and others. So they have to understand how all that comes together, which is something we're looking at training our military of the future, our young warriors about. The same lieutenant out there that we're trying to train this may be the same lieutenant that is out there and CNN sticks a microphone in front of them. So what they say on that microphone could be taken as gospel all the way back here in the homeland, because that's what we see right away, and it's instantaneous. The other thing in the homeland that we're concerned about and training our future leaders about is dealing with the media. We constantly talk about in our headquarters when a disaster strikes, CNN can be there with a truck and a microphone in a matter of minutes, and they can turn on you and say, okay, where are you at? Where's our response? Where's our first responders, our state response, and our federal response? Why aren't you here? I'm here. So you got to deal with that. And what we always talk about is share information as rapidly as you can. Don't ignore it. You got to get out in front of it. So all of our leaders that we deal with, especially our defense coordinating officers, are very well educated in this area to make sure, understand the media in your area, make partnerships with them early, because they're going to be there and you've got to be able to feed them information. And then the last bullet on there, in the homeland, it's so different. Again, we want to protect civil liberties of our citizens. So we deal in all these various authorities, and we want to understand who the players are when we come into a disaster. Who is the chief of police? Who's the first responders on fire and on medical? So we can team up, because they're in charge, and we're going to support them when we get a call to come in. So I'll wrap it up here, but really unique partnerships in our COCOM, different than any other combatant command. We rely heavily on the National Guard of understanding what they have in capabilities. Right now we're doing work, two things. One, we're looking at the hurricane season, which has just been published. Probably they're advertising an above average year again with 16 named hurricanes. And what we're doing is looking at that, working with FEMA and the National Guard to determine what capability gaps, what units might be gone from the U.S. that have deployed overseas that we might want to help backfill and be prepared to support FEMA in the hurricane season. The other thing, we're working closely with the interagency. Tomorrow I head to D.C. and we'll be working with FEMA on a New Madrid earthquake scenario. It's a large exercise that's going to occur in 8 states and 4 FEMA regions in May. It's a week-long exercise. FEMA will actually deploy, probably Administrator Fugate will move to a closer location to the Midwest. The New Madrid is based out of southeast Missouri, Arkansas, Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois. But we're going to test a new concept that Administrator Fugate talks about, where he moves part of FEMA forward, closer to the disaster, to provide a better support capability and more on the ground. And so we're looking at where the military fits in. So this week we're going to do the first exercise leading up to the May exercise. So we partner closely with them. And then one thing that we make it very clear to all new military coming in our organization is that we are a supporting organization when called upon. So when a governor requests it and the president says, yes, NORTHCOM through Department of Homeland Security and FEMA, go, then we go in, but we're going to be supporting you, whether it's a state or it's a local emergency manager. We're going to be there to help them. I think that was it. Probably a little bit longer than what I said.
Questions?
Noble Eagle?
Okay, go ahead.
Noble Eagle, what is that?
Noble Eagle. When I talked about that aircraft that left the West Coast, headed to the East Coast, Operation Noble Eagle is how we would respond. And there is an operations order that gives us our direction, gives us our parameters, who we're supporting. And that's really the follow-on to 9/11. When 9/11 started, the military wrote Operation Noble Eagle for the Homeland. And that was whether we were closing 150 U.S. installations. I mean, closing as far as where you used to be able to drive on, now you got guards. We were doing all that reconstruction so the facilities could be guarded. That was on the land side. But on the air side, the Noble Eagle mission is going on every day, is those 40 fighters that are ready to intercept.
I was wondering if you could comment on what your thoughts of the probability of the United States experiencing an electromagnetic pulse, and given how high-tech our military is, how prepared is the military for that, and how prepared is the country in general for that?
Now, I'm not an expert in this area at all, but I'm learning rapidly that we are very vulnerable in that area, in the homeland. As our primary industries are very vulnerable, our vehicles are vulnerable, you name it, we are very vulnerable to that. And there are some countries that are looking at developing capabilities that could shut us down in that area. From a military perspective, we work very closely at looking at the future and how do we, if our current headquarters can't function, where do we go in the case of EMP threat? And do we have a place to go? And we're looking at that very seriously. We're actually expending funds and building capability now for that. So day to day where we function may not be the where we function if there's a threat for electromagnetic pulse. But I think the civilian side, we would come to a screeching halt. I mean, there's a lot of folks in here probably from industry that could talk more, but I haven't seen much. And there are some countries that are looking seriously at that.
Was there any concern or involvement with the recent incident in Washington where they couldn't get the air traffic control to respond to the plane, and apparently had fallen asleep in there or something?
Yes. Yes, every one of those. And what happens 24/7 in our command center in Colorado Springs, and then we have an air staff that's on, we call it the air domain. In fact, Andy, you worked in the Maritime domain right there. He was one of the guys watching the Maritime, my XO there. But what happens there is FAA has a representative in our headquarters. So we see the air picture up on screens all over our command center. And as something occurs, the FAA rep or the TSA rep will give us a quick heads up. And then we'll have the domestic events network going on at the same time. So it's turned on. So we're hearing everything, that's all the chatter, whatever's going on. And then we'll take direction from FAA. And they'll say, we've got something we can't deal with. We need your help. So then the first thing that would be done is they bring up a Noble Eagle conference, we call it. And in that conference call, they push about 2 buttons and all the phones come up at different locations around the map. But in that conference call, you'll have the Pentagon, the National Military Command Center. You'll have the head location for FAA. You'll probably have TSA on there somewhere. You'll have the DHS NOC on there, Department of Homeland Security, their command center equivalent. We'll bring up the sector that it's in, because we have different sectors of NORAD. And in the case of that one, we'll bring up Continental United States region, East Sector, and they'll come up and then they'll kind of take control of it, and they'll take direction from FEMA. And then FBI may be involved, the intel community may be there, and they're all chatting about this in this conference call, and then making decisions of where to go. It's pretty quick though. As soon as FAA says we don't have communications, we're putting fighters on alert. And the fighters in that case, they were actually airborne. The national capital region though, over our capital, is very difficult to deal in because of the distance and time. And then most of the aircraft coming through that are violators are small Cessnas. And it's very difficult for the F-16s out of Andrews to slow down. So we use the Blackjack helicopters. In fact, we had one last summer that I was on the call, and FAA called and said we got an aircraft that's coming in from Manassas up on the southwest part of town. Came out of Richmond, not supposed to be there. And so Blackjack, which is the Coast Guard helicopters, they're based out of the DC area. We tried to get them, but they were on the ground and they weren't. We actually had the F-16s airborne, so we said, well, go intercept them and see what this guy's doing. And it ended up being a student pilot that was lost. So as soon as they can go on the guard net. As soon as he sees the fighters, he gets on and says, hey, help me, I'm lost. He said, yeah, you are. You're heading right for the Capitol. But a lot of that happens. And I will tell you one other thing that Admiral Winterfeld's been pretty adamant about, and he works closely with the press, with the Secretary of Defense to make sure they're aware of it, with the Federal Administration, or Federal Aviation Administration, as well as Secretary Napolitano's staff. If we scramble aircraft, we're going to be very proactive to make sure they're up so they can do something, or why have them. So in the case of the printer bombs, at that same time, that aircraft that was coming in, that they had a disturbance on board. There was some indication that there could have been some ties to that aircraft, and we intercepted. We didn't intercept it, we tailed it at 10 miles back. At first, we got a little criticism about doing that. Admiral Winterfeld laid out the facts of what we knew at the time. In the end, there was no threat to that aircraft, but because there was a threat internationally at the time, we put the people on board didn't know there was a fighter 10 miles behind them. But if you don't do that, you can't respond when something does happen, and then you get back into a 9/11 type scenario.
I was somewhat disappointed in some of the response times on the blue side of the equation. You had up there 96 hours,
Yeah.
48 hours. Are y'all trying to bring the time down? It seems like that's low.
Well, if you look at on the green side, those forces are there first, and then we're building upon that. The problem you get into when you try to move a force of 5,200 and all the equipment that goes with it. One company of the unit that we just sent to Japan had 130 short tons of equipment. So it becomes a physics thing where you just can't move it that much that fast. The initial team, we'll have them out the door in a matter of minutes. So they will be coming in, but then over the whole force has that amount of time to flow in. And a lot of it is physics and just being able to move it.
So in today's world, let's say helicopters, or something blows up on the side of town, and they have to use helicopters to do something. We have a few helicopters based here in Houston, but time-wise, what does it take to get an adequate number of helicopters? Yeah. The Coast Guard has, what, 4 or 5 based here, and you have 2 or 3 small cutters here, but is that really adequate?
across the map, the Army alone, now a lot of those are deployed right now, but the Army has just about 3,200 helicopters across the map. So we can access those if we can't get the ones we need. We really want the ones in that blue box because they've been trained how to stay out of a dirty area and how to communicate and work with the people and understand the environment they're going into. But in that first blue box, we have 32 helicopters allocated to us for that mission. And they're in 7 locations around the map right now. So, you know, again, depending on where the incident occurs, we can bring in. But if it's an immediate need and we can't wait, we can put a request for forces back through the Pentagon and get access to somebody else. A lot of times it may be, you know, the Coast Guard's going to be just like right now. The Coast Guard's in North Dakota, and the National Guard's got, I think, 3 helicopters on call. And we have none because, you know, all the capability that's right there already. So we would look at each incident. But the big, those numbers you see, that's what they have to train to be ready to move out and have everything loaded up and move. But the force packages, the smaller elements, will send an early entry team in quick.
My question has to do with the green side. Air sovereignty alert status, or a mission that we have here at Houston, Ellington Field Joint Reserve Base in particular. Back in BRAC, you know, Gene Tulick and myself led the BRAC fight against losing our Air National Guard wing. We were not successful in that. We were successful in building up a much larger base of joint forces out there now, where we have 6,000 troops across all 5 services. But dealing specifically with the air sovereignty alert status, we keep hearing at times that there continues to be evaluations around the country by the Air Force, Northcom, Guard Bureau. We feel we have a good support from the Guard Bureau. General McKinney is definitely in our favor of hanging on to the air sovereignty alert status. We feel that the Northcom is also on our side. Sometimes we're not sure about the Air Force and where they really want to position their ASA missions and so around the country. With Houston area being such a huge national security area, where we have all 17 of the major vulnerable type of targets for Al Qaeda to hit. We just feel that we've got to hang on to the ASA. I guess the question is, what do we need to do, working with Northcom to make sure we hang on to that status?
I think most of the time right now, I think New Orleans fighters cover this area, don't they?
Oklahoma. Yes.
Oh, Tulsa's closer. Okay. This is a unique role. I mean, the National Guard can, you know, ask for certain certain types of fighters, and look at the array of air sovereignty alert. But Admiral Winnefeld has a responsibility to do the analytics behind it and present these are the capabilities that we need within the region. And especially since this is a public policy group, the policy debate that's going on right now is what can we afford for the future? And Admiral Winnefeld keeps talking about capability that may be something less than a fighter, that can still respond in some areas, that could maybe fly for half the price or a third of the price. AT-6, for example. But we have to do the analysis with NORAD and then lay it out for the Air Force, who's got to pay for most of it, and then also work with Canada to make sure Canada agrees, and then say, okay, what risk as a nation are we willing to accept in the homeland? And what are we willing to pay for? And that debate has been going on probably most robustly in the last few weeks. I think there's a report due out by NORAD coming up, I forget when it is, in the near future to Congress about what do we need in air sovereignty alert, you know, for the various air control levels, 1 through 5. So the problem we get into at Northcom is people will say, well, you know, will you support the F-35 program? We can't ask for a type of aircraft. We can just say, we lay it out. In order to respond in these time frames in this part of the country, here's what it takes geographically, as well as here's what it takes in the number of aircraft.
That type of approach, that's satisfactory. What we got to make sure of is that we don't get forgotten again from an air sovereignty alert status when we have such a huge amount of vulnerable targets in this area. And you're exactly right. Whatever the methodology is, as long as it's deemed through the analytics as something that works, then that's fine. Just want to make sure we don't get forgotten again.
Sure. The other thing that's going on right now, we're working closely with DHS and FAA, is the future of air control and the space-based platforms. And what will that mean? And will our fighters, Canadians are already actually ahead of us on that, but what do we have to install on the fighters to be able to communicate in the future in this realm where they're supporting and tracking civilian aircraft at the response of a request from FAA or TSA? So we're working through that as well.
We've still been trying to work into the AT-26 type of aircraft, as well as the unmanned aerial systems. We fly those today. We're pretty much positioned to continue to protect this area as well as the border area from Ellington as well. So, okay.
Just wanted to know what your thoughts were on the accuracy. In the news media, in some cases, they're reporting that the drug cartels are partnering with Al-Qaeda, and in some cases, there's some Al-Qaeda presence down in Mexico. Are you seeing reality to that?
We're watching it closely. I will tell you that we've already seen certain groups that would show up on a no-fly list, and you can't really pin them down because their relationship with Al-Qaeda has been so far in the past now. But we're really watching it close, because if our borders are that porous that people can walk back and forth, for drug traffic, then it could happen. Tunneling is a big thing that we're working on right now with the Corps of Engineers, and the Corps has we call it, a joint test on the southwest border, and we're developing technology that you can't go out and buy. So we're testing it for other parts of the world that the military will use. So the Corps we're learning a lot, and they want to share that information with Customs Border Protection, and maybe once the stuff is commercially exportable, then other agencies of the U.S. government, maybe Mexico might buy some of that. But some of the tunnels are phenomenal that we're finding. But it could easily happen, exactly what you're saying, so we're watching.
Sir, with reference to the partnership that we have with Mexico on the training and the equipment we're providing, which I think is an acceptable, very good thing, what steps do you take to make sure that the people that are trained and the equipment that's provided don't wind up in the cartel's hands?
Actually, there was a congressman that asked me that question not too long ago.
Yeah, that wasn't me.
But everyone we work with has to be vetted. And then through the U.S. Embassy, the equipment is tracked. The people that use the equipment is tracked. Can I say that 100% that people are never going to get their hands on it? No, I can't say that. But we do everything within our power to figure out who was trained, work closely with Samar Sedena, who, again, we have a great relationship. We have liaisons to make sure we have the right people vetted. Congress requires us to report out. Another thing that we've been working closely with Samar and Sedena at their request is human rights training for all levels of their military. And our plans director, General Studstream, Air Force 2-star, he spent a lot of time back and forth in Mexico City and working closely with Samar and Sedena. And I haven't been down there recently, but he said he is so impressed by the mid-level officers that he comes in contact with in the Mexican military. They are very aggressive, very eager. They want to make a go for their country. Their big concern right now is, and you see it here in Texas probably more than anything, is people with the wherewithal to leave, the middle class, the people that could create the industry. If they've got money, they're leaving. They're leaving the country. And so, the folks that you want in your nation to help develop the nation and educate the children, and they're all leaving. And so it's The military is very concerned about that as well because they draw from the same population. So.
I saw two news videos on what appeared to be a seaborne missile launch off of California and Padre Island in the Gulf. And then I never heard anything about it. I just wondered.
Yeah. In fact, I think if the boss was asked that, Admiral Winterfeld was asked that question during his testimony. We had no indications with all the systems, and we can track every launch, space launch anywhere in the world. Our systems will pick it up. We had no indication. The only thing that we've come up with that we've looked at through the NORAD side is that if you remember seeing that, and there were several other things going on at the same time, that contrail was created by an airplane or something like that. Because when we went back and reviewed all of the footage and tapes of that region, there was nothing that would show a launch there. We track space junk. There's 9,000 pieces of space junk rotating in orbit around us. We track it for a couple of reasons. One is Air Force Space Command, really they are the ones tracking. We're tracking it from the Homeland perspective in case a piece like happened a few years ago under burnt frost that came burning through our atmosphere. But the other reason we track it is when the space station's out there, and if a shuttle goes up, for an experiment or delivery, whatever, every so often they may have to move it. Because if they have a conjunction coming with a piece of space junk, they got to move that out of the way. So we work closely with Space Command. So we're tracking, 9,000 pieces of space junk, probably about, Andy, once a week something comes, we'll get, hey, this piece is coming in, and it'll hit the atmosphere and burn up. Once in a while it'll make it through and fall in the ocean. So we've got good technology, but there was nothing on that contrail. So we think it was probably an aircraft that left that out there. So that's all we've been able to come up with.
One question. It looks to me like with the drones that we're using, they seem like a great program and we're doing some really fantastic things with them, but it also seems like it would be a very cheap device for somebody else to be able to, conduct war against us. Is that a threat now?
Drones, cruise missiles, the proliferation of cruise missiles are a couple of things we're very concerned about because the ability to defend against those are very, very costly to put up any kind of an air defense for such a large area. So we are definitely looking at that closely. Canada is very interested in that. During the Vancouver Olympics, early on, we discussed a thing called integrated air missile defense. And Canada's, they're not involved with our ballistic missile defense at all. That's their decision as a sovereign nation. But they are interested in ballistic missile, or the missile threat from things like whether it's a scud in the tub or a cruise coming in, cruise missile, or a unmanned system that somebody launches off of, especially off of a ship, you don't even know is there. So we're looking at ways to try to figure out in the future how do we build that capability and use it. The reason the Canadians were interested during the Vancouver Olympics, if there would have been a threat, they wanted us to look at leasing them some air defense systems that we have today, specifically for point-type targets. We have a capability that's exportable right now out of the National Capital Region, and it's a mix of Avengers and that type of system that in the case of like a G20 summit, if we got intel that said there was a threat against that event, that we could put a kind of a cap over it. But a lot of work to be done there yet. Yes.
Good evening, sir. Fisherman Eddie. You spoke earlier about the maritime warning system. What role do you see the Navy taking in that in the future?
Sure. As we look at the Maritime Warning Mission under the NORAD Treaty, which maritime warning was added in 2006 as a part of that NORAD agreement, we're looking at capabilities that might be needed in the warning side, but also partnering with law enforcement, with NAV Canada, with the U.S. Coast Guard to determine what capabilities the law enforcement would bring. The Coast Guard would be such a huge player, and Captain here could probably give you a lot more discussions. But let's say it's a named terrorist organization, and we happen to know they may have a weapon of mass destruction or something, that could transition then to a Homeland defense response, and then we would partner with the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard might actually change into Title 10 under the Navy at that point and take the lead. But we're working through all the protocols it would take to do that. And a lot of that would occur through what's called a motor call in the U.S., a MERP call in Canada, where you get all the key leaders on the call, including the interagency partners, and then you make a determination of, okay, what do we know? Who has the capability to respond to this and move in? So something we had not too long ago, we've learned a lot from, was last summer. There was a ship coming out of Indonesia with 490 mostly Tamils on board, and it was headed to Vancouver. And we knew it was going there. And so we were tracking it closely with Canada. And at first there was some debate whether there were anybody, any people on board who may have had ties to terrorist organizations. But mostly it was people that gave up their whole life savings to get to North America, and they were headed to Canada. And with Canada's immigration laws, it makes it pretty easy for them to get there and stay there. If they came to the U.S., they would be deported. So they're headed to Straits of Juan de Fuca between British Columbia and Washington State. We're concerned because the vessel, first of all, 490 people, the vessel was not very seaworthy. If it sunk or started to sink, we wanted to team up with Canada to have a rescue capability with the Coast Guard and U.S. Navy. And as we planned through this, it actually broke down once in the Pacific, and then they got it started again, the owner did. And they bring these ships in and they just scuttle them in the bay somewhere and get everybody off. Well, as it came into the Straits, the Coast Guard called the U.S. Navy through us and said, we need kind of a lily pad. We need an amphibious ship that we can set up on so that if this thing goes dead in the Straits and floats into U.S. waters, that we can respond. So we actually provided the USS Green Bay and the northwestern part of the United States. The Coast Guard had the lead on it, and we were in support of them and law enforcement. Luckily, it went on in. Unluckily for Canada, it went on into Vancouver, and Canada told us they would be very happy if it would have floated in our waters. But it's something that we've learned a lot from about command and control, of working closely with the Coast Guard. At one point, the Coast Guard had, I forget what you call it, it's the, Captain Woldring, it's the 80-person team that goes in.
The MSST.
Yeah, MSST. They were there on the ship. They had 3 smaller vessels in the dry dock underneath the wet dock, and then they had helicopters on board, so it would have been launching from there. But again, it was the Navy supporting Coast Guard. And then it goes back to my slide and my conversation about authorities in the homeland are so different, and we want to make sure that we don't cross that line. I mean, that's been one of the successes of our military and civilian. You know, we're led by the civilians. You know, Secretary Gates being the lead for Department of Defense. And when the mission goes into the law enforcement side, you know, he'll support a law enforcement, but Department of Defense is not involved in the action. In this case, the Coast Guard, who works for the Department of Homeland Security in Title 14, can do law enforcement. We can support them, so that's really how we get involved.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you all for coming. For a moment, we're going to pass water. Nice to see you. Thank you.